Several years ago, I made a video about fan-made Final Fantasy tabletop role-playing games. As time went on from the release, I've both found more, and more have been released. And given that I'm ultimately here for the fans of our fantasy games, I figured it's finally time to make another. So I present to you, Fan-Made Final Fantasies, Disc 2. I'm going to start this off with some quick mentions about some commercially available games. Starting with Fabula Ultima. Fabula Ultima is a very interesting case. I was there for the very conception of this game. Emanuele Galato started this off as a hack of the game Ryutama, and it eventually spiraled into its own things. And among the years he was hacking away, it ended up looking nothing like its original inspiration. But that's a misnomer of a statement. Ryutama was but one source of inspiration. Those of you up to speed on your Latin probably recognize that the name itself is a nod to Final Fantasy, roughly translating to Last Fable. And Fabula has even come full circle, with a special edition printing featuring cover art by Yoshitaka Amano, whose very style defined the Final Fantasy series. I'm aware that the Final Fantasy XIV tabletop role-playing game exists. One day, I'm going to get a copy of it myself, even though I have difficulty playing the computer version of Final Fantasy XIV these days. If there's things to be said about it, as of writing this in the September of the year of our Lord 2025, I have not heard it. In fact, this game came out at a time when Square Enix was starting to get more into publishing board games in the North American market. Now, these are all fine and dandy and all, but they miss a very important point. We're here for fan-made Final Fantasies, not commercially available games that you'd pay real money for. So we're not going to dwell on those two anymore, and move on to the feature presentation. If you happen to be unable to shell out money needed for a copy of the official Final Fantasy XIV tabletop role-playing game, or you did but think it isn't enough like Dungeons & Dragons, fret not. There is a conversion of D&D 5th edition to include things from Final Fantasy XIV. At slightly less than 140 pages, the Final Fantasy XIV Dungeons & Dragons Compendium features various races, classes, and new spells for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition based on the things you'd find in Final Fantasy XIV. This book is meant to have more fidelity to Dungeons & Dragons than Final Fantasy, so it's more like, hey kid, you want to add some Final Fantasy to your D&D? All the while, it still allows for, and in fact requires, the core Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition materials. As of the writing of this script, Final Fantasy XIV Compendium seems to get regular updates every year or so. It also periodically refers to another project called the Meteor Survivors Project, that also adds the AIM Final Fantasy XIV classes to Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. However, if you don't want Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition in your Final Fantasy XIV tabletop role-playing game, this is where our next entry comes in. Eorzea Fantasy is a modern game that seems to be based mostly on Final Fantasy XIV. It is presented as a collection of documents hosted on Google Drive as of this writing. Not much stands out to me about this one other than how there seems to be an emphasis on status effects. There is a massive list of them. Hardly surprising given how many different status effects there are in Final Fantasy XIV, many of them from the gimmicks of different boss fights. Another significant change from the Final Fantasy XIV source material is that materia behaves more like it did in Final Fantasy VII in Eorzea Fantasy. And this is a change I don't really mind, since it never seemed like materia did much when I was playing Final Fantasy XIV. Otherwise, the scale remains small and manageable, a useful trait of any tabletop role-playing game, but there's not much else of interest I have to say. Eorzea Fantasy reminds me that people will always make things, regardless of what tools they have available. They'll make whatever they have on hand work for them. And so, they recreated Final Fantasy XIV as a tabletop role-playing game, presumably written and stored entirely via Google Documents. Final Fantasy Saga is a wiki for playing Final Fantasy using the D20 Saga system, a Star Wars RPG that was based on Dungeons & Dragons 3.5, and it leans most heavily into the Final Fantasy Tactics series. It's not complete, either because necessary core rules haven't been included or are assumed to be understood as part of the D20 Saga system, which, truth be told, beyond a few numeric adjustments, it isn't really too different from Dungeons & Dragons 3.5. So if you got the know-how of how to run Dungeons & Dragons 3.5, and don't mind having to make a few leaps in logic, Final Fantasy Saga is complete enough to run. Just know that you're going to have to do a lot of your own work to get it going and keep it moving, and most of what you're going to get is reskinned Star Wars Sagas Edition. It also hasn't been updated in a very long time, so I wouldn't expect that to change anytime soon. Worth noting is that there's also a second attempt at using the D20 Saga system to make a Final Fantasy game that also borrows from Final Fantasy Tactics. This one was creatively named Final Fantasy D20, which there's already quite a few of these sorts of games already that have this permutation of this name, to say nothing of the numerous attempts at creating Final Fantasy classes for D&D 3.5 that came about at the same time as these two Saga editions. That said, this one is yet another wiki, with ample explanation of the basic rules and plenty more content that's more like Final Fantasy and less just a renaming of Star Wars Saga Edition. And as its predecessor, it hasn't been updated in a long time. I don't have much else to say about this iteration of Final Fantasy D20 specifically, but this kind of video where I talk more about fan-made games never feels complete without a digression showing my love for the old days of the internet. When I was looking through the different pages of its wiki to see if there was anything really remarkable I could say about it, I looked into their creatures section. There, I found that they used a guide called Monster Manual 3 on a business card. So I read that, poked around some to get more details straight, and that was content from Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition. Yes, the one edition of Dungeons & Dragons that seemingly nobody liked. People are hacking Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 using borrowed elements from 4th edition. And much to my surprise, this post from 15 years ago as of writing this script is part of a blog called The Blog of Holding, which is still active to this day. The internet can be a very wonderful place when you leave the walled gardens of social media websites. In fact, it was wandering around the wilds of the internet and people's personal web pages that I happened across our next feature. The Returner's Final Fantasy role-playing game 2.0. I found this sometime after I had made the first fan-made Final Fantasy video, and this was what originally got me thinking about making a second. I just didn't have enough material until recently. The copy I found lists 2001 as its last update, and a foreword by the main writer said that 2.0 was the last major overhaul of the system that he wanted. Now, knowing that we have a 3rd edition of this, with numerous forks, and a 4th edition, means that he never got his wish. Not that it was likely to stay that way anyways, since where I found the 2.0 document, I also remember finding a work in progress of a 2.5 revision, which I'll touch on a little bit later. This document is something of a time capsule of the 90s and 2000s internet zeitgeist, especially since it comes from an era when we were still codifying tabletop RPG design. Tabletop RPGs were just over 25 years old at this point, and the internet hadn't quite become an information powerhouse yet. From a design standpoint, this game has modifiers for days, scales things in a fashion that's a little excessive to our contemporary tastes. And another strange quirk of Final Fantasy Tabletop RPG 2nd Edition was that it included some content from games that were not Final Fantasy. It included a few races from Secret of Mana as well as some items from Chrono Trigger, both of which were Squaresoft properties. While that's an unusual stretch, up to this point, Final Fantasy wasn't quite the massive franchise it is today. In fact, it wasn't unusual for Square of America to rebrand video games as Final Fantasy. Two such games that come to mind here are Final Fantasy Adventure and Legend for the original Game Boy. These were definitely not Final Fantasy games, though they kind of maybe had similar theming, almost. Anyways, another thing worth noting is how Final Fantasy RPG 2nd Edition tried to classify much of what was going on in the world of Final Fantasy, which was, and still is, all over the place. An excerpt I found to this effect is how they tried to explain the elemental cosmology of the series, which is something you don't typically see happen in these games. And in fact, Final Fantasy XIV was the first time I can recall seeing it actually happen in-game. I also came across some chat logs of sessions of Final Fantasy RPG 2nd Edition being played, and I'll include a link of those in the description. As I mentioned earlier, I found a PDF labeled Final Fantasy RPG 2.5, a revision of the 2nd edition with some new features added and a little bit of cleaning up of some of the lore. But this was also incomplete. I wanted to see how much of a stepping stone it was in this state from 2E to 3E, and to remind myself of how 3E worked, and if it was a revision of the rules or an overhaul. So I went through, picked a few random things to see how and if they changed. The minutiae I found explaining how one transitioned to the other wasn't too interesting. There was a few instances of numbers being rescaled, some lists being cut down, but as I mentioned, the copy of 2.5 I found was incomplete. Much of the rules were very to the point compared to 2E and 3E. It's likely that the writers of 2.5 at the time were worrying more about getting the rules down before they could worry about adding fluffier bits. Unfortunately, given recent changes to how search engines work now, I'm not able to find where I originally discovered these PDFs several years ago. The one thing worth noting in this is that there was a significant amount of content for Final Fantasy Tactics Advance that was included in this document, which didn't seem to make it through to 3E. Omega Fantasy is short and to the point, weighing in at less than 50 pages. It has everything you'd expect from a tabletop RPG adaptation of a video game series the size of Final Fantasy, without the bloat of trying to cram every possible thing inside. You've got familiar classes with a little bit of customization that nods to the more obscure parts. The equipment lists and examples thereof are sparse, but have blanks that you can fill in with your own write-ups. It also has an ample bestiary and monster creation rules. And they fit in a few pages of the fluffier aspects of tabletop role-playing games. And it finishes the book off with a scenario that has all manner of familiar pieces, including a battle on a big bridge. It's got everything, it's not big and overwhelming, and I was able to read it all in one evening. It was nice and concise, and I think the only appropriate way to honor it is by making this segment about it the same way. Or at least it would be, if there wasn't a sequel. Omega Fantasy 2 boasts a rebalancing of its predecessor in addition to having extra content. It still keeps a low page count, and most of the extra content is stuff that can be pretty easily ignored if you just want the rule updates. The extra content in question is scenarios a game master can run that recreate some of the iconic scenes from different Final Fantasy games. These scenarios also gamify non-combat scenarios some, as you do often see in some of the later Final Fantasy games from 6 and onwards. This extra content makes Omega 2 weigh in at a heftier, but still lightweight 100 pages. Final Fantasy Legend Edition is my favorite of this entire set that I've found for Disc 2, and it is a stark contrast from Omega Fantasy. Where Omega Fantasy series sought to pack the essentials of Final Fantasy into a small package, Legend Edition does the complete opposite. It packs as much as it can into a 600 some odd page count, giving you as much content as possible that sounds true to Final Fantasy. And their meta information is kind of humble. They admit they're just one part in a larger legacy. They're just one answer of many to the questions of how do you Final Fantasy in tabletop RPG? And they answer this by fixating less on canon, like the Returner series that started this mess, and more by focusing on the mythos and the aesthetic. Because at this point, we've had close to 20 mainline Final Fantasy games, and entirely too many spin-offs. Final Fantasy isn't even consistent with itself, except for when it is. As for how it works mechanically, it uses a singular d20 along with a mix of d6s in some instances for basic rolls, and other dice for other effects. When you make your character, you're given a great deal of customization. You pick 3 different jobs, which harkens to how characters in Final Fantasy typically wind up being more than just one thing. Freya from Final Fantasy IX was equal parts Red Mage and Dragoon, while Dagger and Eiko were both Summoner and White Mage, with either one of the two leaning more into one aspect over the other. In fact, even your character's weapon of choice is customized, cutting back on the massive weapon lists you typically find in these adaptations. And if these options are daunting and dizzying, worry not. They include more than enough examples of how they use the rules to make many different things. So in this case, you can pick your favorite Final Fantasy character, and you can probably find their listing for a combination of jobs to recreate them. Look through the weapon examples, and you can find something similar to what they used. And if you're somehow not content with what's offered and desire yet more content, there's an addendum called Ultimania that has the cut content from the core book. So, if you're like me and want to know what the rules say about playing as one of the floppy-eared doggo wizards, the new move from Ivil's setting of Final Fantasy Tactics, check out Ultimania. It's probably in there. One other really important thing worth noting about Final Fantasy Legend Edition is that, in a very Final Fantasy fashion, it tries to be more than just a combat simulation, which is something you don't see much in tabletop role-playing games, where the rules for anything non-combat related boil down to, I don't know, roll a skill and the GM will make something up. And I honestly want to see more frameworks for game masters to pour their own ideas into when they have to make something up. Final Fantasy is a series that's been around for a good long time, almost 40 years at this point. It's gone on long enough that it has a twisting and turning mythos, with many different eras that cropped up as the series evolved, but still plenty of recurring themes. Crystals, technology versus nature, an evil empire or other massive organization ignoring the plight of the world, the and aga suffixes for the progression of spells, and most importantly, a man named Cid. The Final Fantasy RPGs that fans have made over the years, be they good or bad, are as much a reflection of the tabletop games of the time as they are of what Final Fantasy was like when they were being made. While I've definitely got a few favorites out of all the different Final Fantasies that exist, they all have their own unique charm in the story that they tell. I never expected to find a reason to make a second video about Final Fantasy, but as the story goes, the plucky devs at Squaresoft never expected their last attempt at making a commercially successful game to ever take off. Ergo its name. Final Fantasy was their last shot after a string of flops, but this computerized version of Dungeons & Dragons was far from the last in its series. Boasting now 16 entries in the main line, a few sequels here or there, and countless spin-offs and knockoffs. Final Fantasy has been a big part of the world's popular culture for decades, and the various Final Fantasy RPG projects are a testament to that. So, with all that said, here is to many more decades.